Hi everyone, welcome back. Hopefully you've spent a bit of time starting to compile your canvas. Now don't worry if you're feeling a little bit lost or a little bit stuck. The live support through the course should be really helpful to you, and of course feel free to reach out to your course mates too through things like Teams. But the point is, don't worry, there's plenty of support on hand to help you get there if something's just not clicking or making sense quite yet. Let's move on to the next part of the canvas. Okay, so as I've said, this left-hand part of the canvas tends to outline the things you need to make the value happen. And this typically translates into this section around costs. So there's a few different things for you to consider, and some things you're probably more familiar with than others. So most of us work in institutions whereby there are specific finance teams which help us figure out what the specific costs are for different research projects, thank goodness. But there's nothing to stop you thinking about kind of broad figures, and it's something that I would really encourage you to think about. Whether it's your research or a new idea, perhaps you're going to have to think about the cost element in some way, even if you don't do the kind of finer work that really, goes into the final proposal. But the point is to think about what different things cost, and to think about cost in different ways as it matters to you. Because all of this is really important, not just the finances, it's the impact on you as a researcher and your colleagues, your collaborators, and the research environment. So let's think more broadly about the costs involved in particular ideas or in research. So I've put a few suggestions here, some probably a bit more obvious than others. What materials do you need? Is there any specialist equipment? Are there any training and development costs in relation to using that equipment? Are you going to have to travel? Obviously, hopefully when all of the pandemic calms down, are you going to have to travel? Are there other kind of consumables, participant expenses, anything with a cost attached to it? Basically, all of the activities and the resources, and even sometimes the partners that you work with, will come with a cost attached to it. So it's thinking about what do you need to finance. The next step, and of course, actually, I didn't mention the dissemination communication cost. I mentioned that, elements of the right-hand side may come with an added cost as well. So it's thinking about how you would build that in to the ask for this. Be that in the form of a research proposal or a funding pitch. The next stage, after kind of dumping all that information down, is to think about your project in terms of timelines and phases. The reason that I mention this at this point is that you may have an idea that you just want to test. You maybe want to do this on a small scale. Or perhaps you've got a really big idea, but actually to get there, you need to do this initial testing work. The reason that I'm advocating this kind of time dimension across costs is really to think about the different funding pots that are available for you to progress your ideas and develop these wonderful projects. So whilst the big picture idea might be several £1 million, actually the initial, let's say, research and testing of a smaller component may cost something like £10,000, and that's typically a much easier amount to go for, at least in the kind of early seed stages of ideas. The extra one I put on there is personal costs. And the reason that I'm drawing your attention to this, as I said before, we are humans with needs and families and lives outside of academia, and often we think about the work that we're doing and the prize that we want to get at the end of it. To actually get to start the research and do the wonderful thing that you're really interested in. But it's worth thinking about personal costs to you. What is this going to cost you in terms of time, in terms of well-being and happiness? I think all too often we don't consider those elements when we're thinking about our research and about taking on new projects. There's something about academia that makes us hungry kind of for the next stage and for the next exciting project, all the while taking on more and more and more responsibility. So I just wanted to build that in, because it's something that I will also mirror on the right hand side there as well. So again, costs, very broadly speaking. So let's think about outcomes, outputs, benefits. What can be gained from this research more generally? What are the outcomes which demonstrate success? Are you looking for increased stakeholder engagement? Is there something that you can talk about there about the impact on different stakeholders? And what's the benefit for you? How are you developing as a result of this? More and more in the big research grants and the big funding competitions, the criteria is turning towards personal and professional development of the researcher. So this is not just us asking you to think about you in all of this. This is something that is starting to become embedded within the whole funding process. So it's an important one to acknowledge. How are you going to be impacted? Now, that's not always an easy story or an easy outcome to discuss. But think about it, for instance, about the skills and experience that you might gain through this project. And actually, you may be wishing to be moving outside of academia. So how does this maybe translate into value outside of the university? Likewise, how does it help you kind of progress and move on to the next stage in university? Are you enhancing employability or the skills of others through what you're doing? Are you perhaps potentially creating jobs? You might be commercialising something, so really you might be looking at bringing in revenues for yourself in the university. What social value are you having? What kind of outcomes and outputs kind of link into the stakeholders, and perhaps even unintended, unexpected outputs and outcomes? So what I'm doing here is taking you from this notion of revenue and generating monetary gain from the research to thinking about the value gained from it in a much broader sense. And that's what I'd like you to do now to complete your canvas. Okay, so hopefully you've got the top sections almost completed. Now I want you to think about how they then translate into these bottom sections. Okay? Think about outputs, outcomes, benefits, not just in terms of the people that your research connects to, but also you. So give that a go, and I'll see you in a minute.